Hey there. So, I'm going out to film a little bit for another film project. But while I'm doing so, figured you'd tag along. Take a drive with me, where we can chit-chat about movies, why I love them, and some of the films that have had a great long-lasting impact on not just my filmmaking life, but my life in general. So let's go. So I know what you're probably thinking. Is Mike really going to try to make basically a video log talking about some of his favorite films and stretch it out to feature-length runtime? And is he going to be able to hold your attention for the duration of that feature-length runtime? I guess we'll see, but certainly won't know unless I try, right? You're also probably wondering, well, gee, he already has a film project in the works. Why doesn't he just use this as his make a movie during the Oscars entry? A couple of reasons for that. One is that this is an idea that's been kind of germinating for a long while now. In fact, I kind of forgot that this was Oscar weekend to begin with, and ended up making some plans to shoot over the weekend for the whole weekend on this particular project. And I'm not going to spoil what that project is yet, because, you know, if you're curious, you'll watch it when it comes out and figure out for yourself what it's about. But I just knew the logistics of the project that I'm going out to shoot right now in conjunction with this project. I just knew it wasn't going to be able to all be handled in one night. There's a lot of spinning wheels, a lot of schedules with other people that I couldn't scrunch into a 3 or 4 hour period on a Sunday night. And on a cold Sunday night, too. So, I'm going out right now just to film some nighttime exterior shots. Along the way, talk a little bit about why I keep at this. Even if hundreds, thousands, or millions of people never see my films, never see what I put out there, why do I keep at this? Try to tie it in to some of my favorite flicks. So ever since I was really little, I've always enjoyed movies. Certainly, growing up in the 80s, had no shortage of fantastical, out there kind of excess in terms of action films or science fiction. I was born the year Return of the Jedi came out, actually just a week or two before Return of the Jedi came out. And so movies have always kind of been there as part of my creative cultural backbone, I suppose, just like several vertebrae in my creative cultural backbone. And I've always appreciated how they can be larger than life, even if the story itself is very rooted in some sense of realism. And certainly my tastes have changed. They've gotten a little bit more elaborate, I guess, or more complex with regards to what it is that I respond to in a film. It's no longer, oh, I need the hero to beat the villain, or I need a happy ending in order to feel a sense of fullness or fulfillment in a movie viewing experience. No, it's far more complex than that now. Don't ask me why, but as I've gotten older, I've been more open in terms of my storytelling and movie palette to the stories that don't necessarily have everything wrapped up in a nice clean bow at the end, or that necessarily have characters 100% clear-cut, protagonist, optimistic type of presentation. In fact, quite a few of my tastes in movies lean more towards ambiguity and extremely morally gray, almost anti-heroes. And two of those films happen to just be some of my favorites. One of my favorite well-put-together films altogether is Zodiac from David Fincher, wherein it's basically almost 3 hours of investigators and reporters and cartoonists tearing out their hair and scratching their head as to the identity of the mysterious Zodiac killer. And the way Fincher establishes such a clear tone of not just tension and suspense, but also frustration and weariness as months turn into years, years turn into, by the end of the film, decades, and you can feel just everyone's exhaustion and frustration with regards to there never being a definitive answer, even if there is a prime suspect. It's never really 100% certain. I kind of love that about the film overall, as much as I love how it's shot, how they're able to recreate the era of the late 60s and 70s so well in the Bay Area. Even though it takes liberties at times with the actual facts of the case for the sake of dramatic heft or characterization, I appreciate that at least it's being honest and open about how damn frustrating it is for things to be left open-ended, such as a decades-old murder case. I also, like I said, love when sometimes our leads aren't the most glamorous, sometimes aren't the most clean-cut or straightforward in terms of their motivations and their actions throughout the film. And a film that I feel does that very effectively, I feel, ironically, I should be talking about right now, is Nicholas Winding Refn's Drive, where our protagonist, played by Ryan Gosling, we never get an established name or even a solid background on, aside from other characters' interactions with him. How throughout all of that, even though he's setting out to set himself up as sort of the hero for what could be a stereotypical damsel in distress in her family, that he goes about it in the most brutal and bloody ways possible. That he's such a sphinx, an enigma to everyone around him. You can't gather whether he's going to do something altruistic or savage to whatever character. Whether he takes his frustrations out on a cohort who is guaranteed to double-cross him, whether he savagely beats and kicks a henchman to death in an elevator, or whether he chews out the man who's been his mentor for most of his adult life and basically abandons him to be left to his own devices and his own failings at the hands of the greater evils in the story. I love that by the end, there's a little play on ambiguity, not just as to the fate of the driver, but a little ambiguity left up to where his moral compass is now. Did his experience in trying to save Carey Mulligan's character from worse criminals actually change him? Or is he just going to float on to his next series of circumstances with the same cryptic motivations and intentions? And I like stories like that, especially as I've come to appreciate that the world itself is ambiguous, that the world itself doesn't leave you on a happy ending sometimes. It's good to know there's an art form out there that can support my mixed emotions towards ambiguity. So before I head off into my location for my scene, I'm going to have a nice little pre-shoot drink. And who knows, maybe the Oscars will be on in the midst of this happening, but I figured this would be a good time to just talk a little bit about some movies that offer a little bit of relaxation, a little bit of libation, a little bit of levity. And a couple of those that came to mind for me: Young Frankenstein from Mel Brooks. There's just something to be said about the subtle and sometimes not so subtle ways in which Mel Brooks can spin a farce and a parody. And Young Frankenstein, I feel, is one of those aspects where you're able to really get a sense of well-rounded characters in spite of their ridiculousness, to have some legitimately sweet moments, mainly from Gene Wilder and Peter Boyle as Frankenstein and Frankenstein's monster, respectively. Not to mention an all-around scene stealer in the form of Madeline Kahn. And yeah, I absolutely adore that movie. I like a lot of Mel Brooks' stuff, but I feel out of all of them, Young Frankenstein is by far his most polished and most brilliantly executed movie. So yeah, I like comedies that kind of go hard on their material and can be funny and character driven and still emotional at their core. And another comedy that I find myself reflecting on, seems serendipity I should be talking about this in front of a municipal building, is Hot Fuzz. And I feel out of the Cornetto trilogy, that is, without a doubt, Edgar Wright's peak out of the three. I like Shaun the Dead. I like parts of The World's End. But Hot Fuzz is a sweet spot for me. Everything is on full display there. His vibrant and eccentric filmmaking tone, his affinity for genre action movies, how they are very clearly but concisely lampooned, and how the characters themselves are fleshed out and believable and likable characters. They just don't have to be, I guess, the Freeberg and Seltzer style of comedy where, oh, it's a parallel of a Schwarzenegger character or Keanu character. No, Nicholas Angel is his own fully realized three-dimensional character. And yeah, what's not to like about Hot Fuzz? I've really become a fan of anthology movies recently. Um, and not necessarily the type of movies where you have outright interconnected storylines or characters, and you just spend time with a handful of them in each of the different act breaks, kind of like a Tarantino film a little bit, but more so um, just different creative teams coming together to tell separate stories and somehow thematically tie them all together into one cohesive feature. And a couple of films have come to mind when I think about it, but one is from one significant director who just decided to tell all the stories, and that is Dreams from Akira Kurosawa, which displays a wide range of not just different stories ranging from grounded, realistic tales to high-flying, adventurous, colorful kind of fairy tales to the post-apocalyptic kind of desolate wasteland to what I felt was the most significant kind of vignette, which was a soldier dealing with his trauma and having the ghosts of his fellow soldiers following and haunting him. And Kurosawa just kind of marries all of these seemingly different tales and characters together so effortlessly. One vignette flows well into the next, even if there are significant breaks between the end of one story and the beginning of another. It never feels as though it's a halting type of experience to go from one tale to the next. And I really like his sensibility of flow in Dreams. And the other film, a more recent film, and by recent I mean like the mid-2000s, that I've come to really appreciate, is an anthology film called Paris Je t'aime, which brings together directors from all around the world: Alfonso Cuarón, the Coen brothers, Gerard Depardieu, Wes Craven, Gus Van Sant, a lot of different styles and a lot of different, I guess, a lot of different kind of tones all merging together to celebrate the city of Paris and all its unique sections in and of itself. You could have a very heartfelt drama about one Parisian boy, discovering his own sense of tolerance and acceptance for others who may not necessarily share his beliefs or his faith. You've got a more wacky type of surreal comedy involving two mimes that meet each other and fall in love. You've got a bit of a horror element mixed in as a hitchhiking American from the States, played by Elijah Wood, comes across a grisly vampire scene. And believe me, that's not the one directed by Wes Craven. It's a pretty beautiful celebration of not just Paris, but the different tones of love and the different tones of companionship one could possibly find in the city of love. And so, anthologies, disparate stories, somehow finding common ground and coming together to help to tell a larger narrative, or at least explore a larger theme in and of themselves. I've become a fan of that type of storytelling and filmmaking. So, this is where I'm going to shoot my scene. Feel it's got nice open space to it. There's going to be a little bit of a thematic tie-in to another scene that I shot earlier here. And I feel now is a good time to explore a little bit of what I'm going to try to accomplish here in this scene, which is exploring the feeling of ennui and restlessness. Because especially over this weekend, as I was meticulously planning out what I want to do with this particular film shoot, and then deciding, you know what, I might as well throw my hat into the ring for this year's Make a Movie During the Oscars challenge. There were a couple films that kind of got me into the mindset of not just the story I want to tell and the character I want to portray, but the tone I want to go for. And that is the double combo of Paris, Texas and The Great Beauty. Because both these films, I feel, work with the themes of restlessness, anxiousness, and ennui so very, very well in their own unique style. One is a quieter, more solemn, more heartbreaking kind of meditation on someone who has experienced a trauma so profound, so impactful that it left him in a fugue state for 4 years. And this is kind of the central starting point of Paris, Texas. Travis wanders out into the great unknown with no memory of what has happened or even a true sense of who he is because of something that he couldn't face, something so terrible and so traumatic. And it all culminates in this beautiful exchange with Natasha Kinski, where this just long take of them communicating through what initially is a one-way mirror, but then they eventually see each other and express to each other the things that needed to be expressed in order for that restlessness, that agitation, that ennui, for that to be able to pass on. And it explores not just what the restlessness does to the individual, but what it does to the people around him, what it does to his loved ones, his son, his brother, his sister-in-law, his wife. It's a piece of cinema that when I first saw it, at this point about 2 years ago, I openly wept at the monologues, at the resolution, at the prolonged pauses within the film. And then on the flip side of things, you got The Great Beauty, which is just bombastic and all out, balls to the wall excess and decadence. But still restlessness, still this clamoring for something deeper, something more meaningful from the protagonist, from Jep. And certainly it's an acquired taste. I'm sure subtitles will absolutely throw some of your regular American viewers off, but believe me when I say it's worth the trip, the nearly 3-hour trip that The Great Beauty is, where certainly a majority of your characters are very vain and vapid and come across as very pretentious. Even our hero, Jep, is somewhat pretentious, and he owns up to it. He admits it. But at the heart of it all, you get to the core of Jep's sadness, of his ennui. his lack of inspiration to carry on further with the writing, to carry on further with engaging with life on a meaningful or personal level, to keep it all superfluous and superficial and, like I said, decadent, because that's easier than attaching oneself to meaningful relationships or meaningful moments. And in spite of, like I said, what can be perceived as some superficial characters, I end up falling in love with each and every one of them in their own unique way. Because eventually, as time goes on, they reveal what they're fighting against, what they're trying to repress or bury or not move on from. I sometimes think how wonderful it would be if our revelations, if our moments of clarity on what drives our restlessness, what drives our need to surround ourselves with superficial dealings, if they could be as grand, as operatic, as cinematic as what they are in The Great Beauty. Because it is, if anything else, a beautiful thing to watch. Okay, so this is going to be my establishing shot. Not mic'd for this because there's not going to necessarily be on-set sound for this. It'll be Foley and atmospheric sound effects. But yeah, you'll probably see this in the other film I'm going to make. Just a little bit more polished, maybe with a little different of a color grading. Who knows? But yeah, enjoy this behind-the-scenes peek. Again, no spoilers, because I want you to kind of discover the story on its own terms. But enjoy just this little fragment. Feel like in my circle of friends, I've always been something of a Lynch apologist, in that everyone in my usual social circle doesn't gravitate towards David Lynch movies as much as I do. They sometimes view them more as sort of self-indulgent, abstract, sort of wankery just for abstract's sake. And I honestly can't view any of his movies like that. Granted, it took me a while to get accustomed to the way he constructs and puts together a story on film, but I found as time went on, I could get to the general emotional core at a lot of his films. And believe me, it is, I feel, sacrilege to be able to pick and choose which of these films I would be talking about here. But in the case of how David Lynch's approach to movie making and how his filmmaking craft has had an impact on me as both a viewer and a filmmaker, two examples come to mind. The first one being The Elephant Man, where it is a more straightforward, linear story, something that David would eventually kind of bend and break the format of with his other films, but The Elephant Man is pretty much a point A to point B style narrative, though not without the charms that David Lynch puts into his characters and backgrounds so effectively. There is a lot of genuine heart and humanity at playing the Elephant Man. And I've talked before about how I feel it's not really a voyeuristic approach to someone who's been othered by society, but planting ourselves firmly in the perspective and in the camp of the Elephant Man himself, Merrick. Part of that's really due to John Hurt's really effective performance and the performances of those around him, such as Anthony Hopkins and Bancroft. But also, it's the cinematic eye that Lynch uses so effectively to not cruelly but coldly ostracize Merrick from the rest of society. How he focuses in on how people are using Merrick and his appearance to their own advantages, to their own profit, to their own advancements. And how Merrick, despite getting the short end of the stick quite frequently throughout his life, how he still resolves to be better, to carry himself with dignity and poise and kindness and grace, even to people that are cruel to him. He really kind of keeps that in check and pushes forward with it. Even after his very emotional, "I'm not an animal, I'm a human being." Even after that, he's able to return to being this very cordial and civil and melancholy yet very charming gentleman. And I think that's one of the most beautiful things about The Elephant Man. And while it's certainly probably not what a lot of people think of when they think of these days the tropes of Lynch, a lot of his more abstract kind of leanings aren't as apparent as this was one of his earlier films following Eraserhead. But I still believe it's one of his most effective pieces of storytelling. And then throughout the years to go from that to something like Fire Walk With Me, where you do have a straightforward story. It's something of a sequel, something of a prequel to the massively successful show Twin Peaks. But also, in spite of it carrying a lot of Peaks' quirkiness and surrealism and terror, it's this very real, very raw, and very brutally honest exploration of a young woman dealing with trauma in her life. Whether it's from drugs, abusive boyfriends, within her own family, and the horrific things that take place to her in her own household, and her just trying to make sense of the world for herself. And even though the movie ultimately goes the way a lot of people who are familiar with the show know it goes, even though it ends in the tragedy that starts the story of Twin Peaks, there's this sense of joyful celebration to some degree in the character of Laura Palmer, where she can smile in spite of all the horrific things that she's endured and witnessed in her all too short life. At the very end, you see her smile, as if to say, the pain and suffering's over now. Now you can truly live. And I've thought about that throughout the years that I've watched Twin Peaks and Fire Walk With Me, and how that one shot, very much so, it stays burned into my brain as a melancholy yet jubilant celebration of a young woman's life. an aspect of this Make a Movie During the Oscars challenge that I've been appreciating, and something I've appreciated a lot about Joel Haver and similar YouTube filmmakers is very much the do-it-yourself approach and mentality towards filmmaking. And again, this is nothing new, as we've had plenty of examples of great independent films made on the cheap or for nothing at all that end up becoming either cult or widespread classics. For example, Carnival of Souls. One of my favorite horror films. And that's saying something on the fact that, by probably today's jump scare standards, it doesn't quite live up to that front, but certainly there's an atmosphere and mood about that movie that still works for me to this day. And all of that done for cheap, done for a pretty basic kind of budget, wherein, the casting, you're just getting people who look interesting to play these apparitions, the locations just being what's available in terms of being these desolate kind of ruined industrial and warehouse docking type of areas, to the music, the organ music, which is maybe corny for some and you feel like you're in the seventh inning stretch, certainly, but I don't know, it works for me. And it works into the character, or being an organist. And that's why partly the reason why she uproots to another town, but also senses or conveys this sense of foreboding dread. Like something about the sonorous tone of the organ just kind of unnerves me every time I hear it, even though I can tell it can be pretty goofy at times. But even like some of the visuals in that film still strike me. There's that one visual early on where she's driving and outside of the passenger window she sees the reflection of the ghoul that's going to be tormenting her throughout a majority of the movie. And even though like you can kind of gather like what the technique was to make that happen, and it's not necessarily the most, crisp or clean type of execution of it, it's still, there's a charm to it that I really love. And if we're speaking about the charm of low-budget indie films, like, of course, Clerks, absolutely, while not being one of my favorite Kevin Smith movies, I admire and I recognize just how versatile he was at that time, putting together this slackerish kind of Gen X comedy by basically maxing out his credit cards. Now, I'm not at that point. I'm going to max out all my accounts for the sake of a movie. No, this is just fun for me at the moment. It's not like a day job that I'm going to see myself springboarding into anytime soon. This is for the fun of it. But certainly I know what it's like to have to try and shoot around more complex kind of sequence, or try to make a scene work when maybe you don't have an actor available. And especially in the times of COVID, trying to make creative collaborations possible when I couldn't be in the same room with people. I don't know, I have a special place in my heart for films that have that, just put on a show for yourself with what you have available. Who cares if it doesn't look like the smoothest, slickest CGI imaginable from James Cameron? Who cares if maybe your acting isn't on par with Daniel Day-Lewis and you flub a line? Just go with the flow, own up to the mistake, own up to the moment. You can do this. What I also enjoy are films that capture subject matter honestly. Documentaries, certainly. There may not be a grand, hyperbolic fictional narrative at work in those films, but it doesn't make the stories any less fascinating for me. And two that come to mind very much for different reasons. I always find kind of my go-to comfort documentaries. One is called Corman's World, which chronicles the life and times of famous B-movie mogul, self-proclaimed B-movie mogul, Roger Corman, and kind of what his method of cranking out so much material and so much film throughout the decades has done actually for the industry. We wouldn't have some of our most prolific filmmakers if it wasn't for the Corman School. Marty Scorsese. We wouldn't have Joe Dante. We wouldn't have Jonathan Demme and his movies, or even some of the rising talent that was discovered through a lot of Corman's movies, like Jack Nicholson or De Niro, Stallone. Quite a few owe a lot to Roger Corman. And I love that this documentary kind of celebrates but also scrutinizes his legacy quite a bit. Takes an honest look at some of his cheesier fare, but then gets into very emotional detail about what was at stake to film something like The Intruder, starring William Shatner. This gripping thriller about racism in the South, and shooting that in the 60s when racism was still prevalent in the South. I mean, still prevalent today, but, you know. I like that documentary. It might seem a little bit more like a fluff piece. I think A&E had something to do with it, but it works for me. And I can appreciate it for what it is. It's just kind of being an all-encompassing look at a filmmaker's career and life. And then this documentary, which I will never get tired of talking about, never shut up about it, Camera Person, Kristen Johnson's beautiful, unique kind of video diary to, if no one else, herself. And how it's just basically not just B-roll of a lot of her projects, but how she's able to take all that pre-existing footage and tie it together into a sort of meta-narrative about her own life, how she grows as an artist and as a person, a mother, how her relationship with her own mother at the time gets strained throughout the years as her mother takes a bit of a turn in her own mental and physical decline. And I appreciate the honesty of it. Even if it might seem like all these scenes, all these moments that she's captured on film may not necessarily have initially nothing much to do with each other, she somehow makes it all work in the end. She somehow makes the random footage of following a herd of sheep tie into visiting this family and showing them the footage she took of them years ago, and them just being in awe of their growth and their change being chronicled on film. That's what film and documentary can be. An honest time capsule of a moment or a thought that we can revisit again and scrutinize or praise or what have you, just to be able to have it there. And I'm very appreciative of camera person was definitely a turning point for me in terms of the way I want to construct narratives or approach projects like this. To just be honest and try to find ways to make seemingly random moments tie together. So, I got about 15 minutes here before the deadline is up. So I figured I'd wrap things up by talking about two films that set a fire to my creativity. Two films that I felt encapsulated an imagination, a creativity, and a passion within movies that I try to carry with me to this day, even as an adult. So let me share those with you here. So the first one I saw when I was really young. And it's not as well known, probably, a film. It was a joint New Zealand English production, I believe, called The Navigator. I know, VHS. The Lost Art. But this movie has stayed with me for about 30 years. It's a fantasy, science fiction, time travel film. It takes place in medieval times, and the bubonic plague is decimating towns and families and people of different walks of life. And this ragtag group of townsfolk and miners, they believe that if they're able to drill to the Earth's core and come out the other side of the world, they'll be able to find a cathedral, a chapel that they can place a forged cross on. And that will somehow end the plague. And the amount of style that goes into telling this story has always captured my imagination. How images, both outlandish and horrific, have stayed with me since I was little. This movie is a dizzying, disorienting experience, even to this day. And I've, I guess, always held that sensibility within me. Even in my own do-it-myself projects, I always think of the off-balance at times filmmaking that goes into The Navigator. I've thought of the mundane 20th century aspects of this movie that certainly would seem frightening to someone from medieval times. And the ending still grips me. The ending still always chokes me up. Even though maybe you can see it coming a mile away, it still, I don't know, it still leaves me both a mixture of hopeful and saddened, which I feel a lot of great art forms can be. A mixture of the good and the bad, and you just learn to balance out both of them in the moment. And that's what I feel The Navigator excels at. And my all-time favorite, Jurassic Park. Probably a little bit more mainstream of a choice. Definitely a blockbuster. But this is the film I've seen the most in my life. And at the age of 9 or 10, this was the film that really sparked a creative fire within me that I carry with me, not just in filmmaking, but in writing and music and all other manners of creative outlets. Certainly, the technological advancements at the time to create photorealistic extinct creatures the way they did in this movie, that's going to be an achievement that certainly will be hard-pressed to be matched for decades to come. Is it Steven Spielberg's best movie? No. But it's certainly the one that has consistently entertained and left a great impression with me throughout the years. Each time I revisit it, whether it's here, in physical media, whether it was on my old VHS tapes, whether it was the 3D re-release, my imagination is still set ablaze by what he was able to pull off in Jurassic Park. And I guess that's something I hope continues on in my life. Even as I round a corner and can now be considered something of an old man, I hope to still have my imagination set ablaze by things. And I hope I'm able to set your imaginations ablaze with some things that I produce. Whether they're this little slice of life look into the real me, whether it's some heightened fantasy or drama or outlandish comedy, whether it's something quieter and more vulnerable. I hope you find those things, because I certainly will continue. Time's up probably here at this point. My education continues. I recently picked up Being There. I've never seen this before. I can't wait to see it now.